Good morning, folks. Great to be back from our Grand Prairie, where we just had our government caucus meeting over the last couple of days, and also to be back from my recent trip to Quebec and to Washington, D.C. I'll give you a bit of an update on that, and I also have an important announcement to make. So very productive visit, I thought. I committed in the 3 years in the lead up to the provincial election to carry Alberta's voice to every corner of the country, and particularly to Quebec. You may recall that the night our government was elected, April 16th of last year, I spoke for several minutes in French about the historic alliance between Albertans and Quebecers and the need for us to renew that alliance and to be partners in prosperity, how Quebecers have benefited so much from Alberta's resources and hopefully will continue to in the future if we can develop those resources. A message I took on a media blitz in Montreal. I think the message was well received. As well, I met with key CEOs from major national and international companies as part of our ongoing efforts to promote renewed investment in Alberta's economy to create jobs here. And I underscored that we will be opening an Alberta office in Quebec this spring to have a full-time presence on the ground in promoting investment, but also better explaining, also underscoring alliances within the Federation and better communicating our message about responsible resource production. In Washington, I was there to obviously address the need for ratification of the NAFTA 2.0 and to underscore the importance of Alberta as the largest source of energy for the United States outside of their borders. We're the largest exporter of energy on Earth. And I think if you've surveyed Americans, over 90% of them would imagine that OPEC is the major source of energy imports. In fact, it is Alberta. 40% of their energy imports come from Canada, primarily from Alberta. So it's hugely important, given the $100 billion of energy products that we export to them, that we constantly reinforce that message with U.S. policymakers. I was very pleased to have the opportunity to meet with and discuss these issues with 4 members of the U.S. administration, of the cabinet, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, with the Secretary of Energy, Dan Brouillette, with Secretary of the Interior, David Bernhardt, and with U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. That meeting was together with a number of Canadian premiers and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland. The premiers Ford, Moe, Legault, Higgs and I were there as a delegation on behalf of the Council of the Federation as part of Team Canada to promote our vital trade links to the United States. I also met with several senior members of the United States Senate and House of Representatives, with several governors at the margins of the National Governors Association meeting, and spoke with key U.S. business and opinion leaders, including the presidents of the United States Chamber of Commerce and the American Petroleum Institute. And so I think we very effectively got our message across. One of the issues on which I was focusing was the importance of getting real tangible progress on the Keystone XL pipeline under the second presidential permit authorizing that to cross the Canada-U.S. border. Optimistic about that project, given TC Energy's indication that it intends to commence construction activity on at the Keystone XL pipeline that would add something like 850,000 additional barrels of egress for Alberta Energy to vital U.S. markets, particularly the heavy oil refineries in the U.S. Gulf region that have lost Venezuela and increasingly are losing Mexico as their source of feedstock, and we need to get our products to them if we're going to maintain that critical access. So I thought it was a very jam-packed trip, and happy that we made that progress. And I will be getting back to Washington at least on an annual basis to underscore that, to continue with the relationships that we've been developing and working on these key issues. Now, I do have an important announcement to make as well. As you recall, in the last election, our party committed to cancel and sell the crude-by-rail contract signed by the Democrat Party in the hours leading up to the last election. You may recall that in February of last year, we gave public notice that any major contract signed by the NDP in the formal statutory campaign period would be subject to a value for money review by a United Conservative government. And in particular, we announced the day after the crude-by-rail contracts were signed our intention to offload those contracts, because we knew that this was something the private sector would be willing to do and should be doing at its risk, not at the expense of taxpayers. Now, you recall the NDP signed a project costs of $10.6 billion. They projected $8.8 billion in incremental revenues to eventually, over the course of 2 years, move 120,000 barrels per day of crude by rail. Now, we have not triggered those contracts, as you know, because we've been working with the private sector to sell those contracts, and I'm pleased to announce that we have done so on very successful terms that will save Alberta taxpayers $500 million. Another promise made, another promise kept. The NDP said that this risky $10.6 billion exposure of taxpayers was necessary to move more crude by rail. But guess what? Over the course of 2019, we saw crude by rail shipments out of Alberta more than triple. We went from about 100,000 barrels per day in January of last year to between 300,000 and 400,000 barrels per day currently. And the industry believes that it's on track towards the logistical maximum of moving 550,000 barrels per day under current conditions. And so the entire premise of the NDP's risky $10 billion deal was proven to be completely wrong, as we projected in February of last year. I'm pleased to tell you that, well, first of all, in the budget, as you may recall, last November, we included as an estimate a $1.5 billion allocation for the cost of divestment. But now that we have completed these transactions, actual costs are $1.3 billion, $200 million less than the budget projection, and $500 million less than would have been the case under the NDP's projections. So this is a $500 million savings, a $500 million savings to taxpayers while we are shipping more and more crude by rail, thanks in part to the special production allowances which our government announced last fall, which are allowing more crude to be shipped by rail unaffected by the production caps through our curtailment quotas. So by transferring the crude by rail program to the private sector, the government is saving Alberta taxpayers $500 million. Shipping crude by rail is something that the private sector is in the best position to be doing itself. Enabling industry-led rail capacity is an important aspect of ensuring sufficient market access to our resources. We promised Albertans that we would act in the best interest and transfer these contracts to industry, and that's exactly what we have done. As a government, we are accountable to the taxpayer. We negotiated the best terms over the past months to get Albertans out of this tough situation. Industry is better able to manage the financial risk associated with the ebbs and flows of the marketplace, and we'll continue to make decisions that achieve the best outcomes for Albertans. By divesting all crude-by-rail contracts, an additional 120,000 barrels per takeaway capacity will come online. Facilities are already being used by industry to move crude oil. Having this additional capacity available to industry will help create the market conditions for companies to make positive investment decisions, such as increasing drilling or oil production to create more jobs. In total, 19 contracts for rail cars, loading and unloading capacity, logistics and other services are being finalized by the Alberta Petroleum Marketing Corporation, which is a Crown corporation, on behalf of the government. Due to commercial confidentiality, additional details about the contracts cannot be released by the government at this point, but they will be in due course once all of those details have been hammered out. So very good news, another promise made, another promise kept, and I'm happy to take your questions. Do you mind if I take the French towards the end, just because we're live streaming?
I just have one about Montreal. Je me demande juste, c'est quoi, c'est qui sera directeur, et puis ça sera quoi sa mission?
On n'a pas fait cette annonce. Ça serait annoncé prochainement.
Just to be clear, is this a $1.3 billion loss?
This is, yes, this is the loss of the NDP decision to sign these contracts. Their actual loss was projected to be $1.8 billion. If you take the $10.6 billion cost, their estimated net revenues of $8.8 billion, we've managed through tough negotiations to whittle that down. Now, the NDP often says that the budget, the deficit went up this fiscal year over last fiscal year by nearly $2 billion. That was almost entirely the charge related to their crude-by-rail deal that they entered into at the very end of last fiscal year that was booked in 2019-2020. So this is entirely on the NDP. They never should have made this deal. The private sector was willing to move this crude-by-rail and has done so. Rachel Notley is entirely responsible for the deal, for its net cost, for the loss. We, however, have managed to limit the damage, reduce the damage by $500 million from 1.8 billion to 1.3 billion.
Can you speak about the difficulties offloading these contracts? Because I know when we've reported on it in the past, we've heard that there's backlogs across North America for these new cars that companies are lined up for years into the future to buy them. So obviously there would be significant demand for those cars. Was that the issue, or was the issue with the contracts in terms of
the issue was not, as I understand it, logistics, because as I've said, we've seen a significant increase in crude-by-rail shipments anyway. So there has been a significant expansion of the relevant fleet of cars available, and the railway companies have accommodated that. This was largely just a very complex series of transactions. I think we're talking about 3 terminals involving over 24 contracts, and we took our time to negotiate the best possible deal for Albertans. We didn't rush into this.
While you were on your trip there, you talked about green transition, the last barrel of oil at some point coming out here. With the talk about TMX increasing costs, Teck mine approval, obviously, why did you choose sort of now to talk about the transition as you see it going forward here?
I think you're referring to somebody's column yesterday. It's funny, things that you've been saying for a long time suddenly become news when people decide that they are. This has essentially been our message for a very long time, that according to the International Energy Agency, they project that there will be a growing global demand for crude oil between now and at least 2040. They project about a 10% increase in their standard projection. They also project a near doubling of natural gas consumption over the next 2 decades. But they have come up with what they call their sustainable projection, which is the most bearish projection for oil consumption in a fully Paris-compliant policy environment. They project, I believe it's 67 million barrels per day, roughly, of consumption in 2040. That's down only 30% from where we are now, at about 100 million a day. And here's our point. So that's even 20 years from now. So that is to say, in any reasonable estimate, 20, 30 years and beyond, there will be tens of millions of barrels of oil being consumed, even in a Paris-compliant world. And our industry is doing everything it can to make the case that we should be the primary source of that energy in those decades to come, in that period of gradual transition. Now, there are some people who have a unscientific utopian view that we can flick a switch and turn off the entire modern industrial economy. By the way, I invite those folks to turn off if they live in Canada, they can always turn off the heat and turn off the lights right now. The reality is, we all need that energy to maintain our basic standard of living, and people in the developing world want access to affordable energy, and I believe it would be immoral of developed countries to lock them into permanent energy poverty. So there will be growing global demand for all forms of energy. There will also be, concurrent with that, a growing share of energy produced by renewable sources. And the point is this: we have an obligation to do our part to address the challenge of climate change, to reduce greenhouse gas, including carbon emissions. Our industry is doing just that. We've reduced carbon intensity for the average barrel of bitumen by 40% since the Kyoto Treaty was signed in 1997, by 30% since the year 2000. And we are credibly on track to reduce the carbon intensity of a barrel of Alberta bitumen by another 20% by the end of this decade. We were the first jurisdiction in the world that I know of to have a a levy on industrial emissions of CO2, which has just been renewed and updated by our government through the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Plan. And we have several major Alberta energy producers who, as a matter of policy, have now committed to net zero production of carbon by 2050. So we are doing our part. And my point is simply this, that we, I believe, are on track to be the amongst the lowest cost, lowest carbon, and certainly lowest risk major sources of energy in the world in that transition period.
But in terms of that transition, how do you see your role in that transition, then, or your government's role in that transition? Even if it's down the road, how do you see...
Well, we see our role primarily as supporting increased technological advances which reduce carbon intensity from our economy generally and the energy industry in particular. You know, a week ago today, the largest solar power project in Canadian history, one of the largest in the world, was announced for Alberta based on this government's policy setting with zero subsidies from ratepayers or taxpayers. It happened because we came up with an intelligent approach to the levy on major emitters, and we ended the punishing retail carbon tax on consumers, while and eliminating the subsidies that was funding, while confirming that we would maintain a predictable, stable, energy-only market. And now we saw a $500 million investment announced last week in renewable energy. In fact, I think we're closing in on $2 billion of renewable power and investments that have been made since our government came to office. So I think you'll continue to see more things like that driven on a market basis and more innovation. You know, a lot of the so-called smart people sneered at a previous PC government for its carbon capture and storage pilot partnership with Shell at the Scotford refinery that was funded by an earlier version of the TIER fund. And guess what? That project is now increasingly showing that it is coming close to being commercially scalable as costs per unit of carbon capture and storage have gone down. And now we see that technology being applied more broadly through carbon capture utilization and storage, which you'll see happening through the carbon trunk line when it comes on stream between Refinery Row and the heart of our sedimentary oil basin to facilitate enhanced oil recovery with a very low carbon footprint. These are the kinds of, so I give credit to a generation of Alberta industry and government leaders for having looked ahead on these issues. So I think we have a great story to tell, and we're going to tell it much more vigorously. Rick.
Premier, as for your letter that you've sent to the Prime Minister, could you please explain to Albertans why it is that the province, now and in the past and likely in the future, has to continually ask, plead, do the Oliver twist, put the bowl out, please, sir, not just some more, something. And this goes on and on. It doesn't matter if things are, I can just see that this is probably also going to happen with TMX. You're going to have to say, please, please, police officers, please, please take these people away from the pipeline that are standing in the way and trespassing. It's just a frustrating and constant story that and not just you, other people that have been where you are now have had to do the same thing. What do you tell Albertans about the fact that you have to constantly go back to people who you've been very, let us say, polite with of late, and still have to make this, as I think you said, it was even unusual that you had to go to that extent. But why? Why are we always having to beg?
You'd have to put that question to the federal government. I do not understand why. You're speaking about Teck Frontier mine. There's a process in law that this company followed for nearly a decade with $1 billion investment. They passed all of the regulatory hurdles at the highest standards in the world with flying colors. And talking about the energy transition, this project is an example of how we can play a role in that transition. It would be in the lowest quartile of carbon intensity of a barrel of oil on Earth, if allowed to go ahead. It would operate at 50% the carbon intensity of a barrel of bitumen, and 50% the carbon intensity of an average barrel of oil in North America. So in that world, not the fantasy land where we fuel a modern economy with pixie dust and unicorn farts, but in the real world, where there's tens of millions of barrels of oil being consumed, I would rather that a progressive Canadian mining company like Teck, at the lowest end of carbon intensity for oil, was part of the source, rather than us abandoning global markets to OPEC dictatorships, to California heavy crude, with a massively higher carbon footprint. So I don't even understand why we're into this argument. I can tell you one thing, though. In Quebec, when there was a government-subsidized cement factory opened 2 years ago, the McInnes cement factory in Gaspésie, which is projected to emit 2 million tons of CO2 every year, they were exempted from environmental review by the federal government. They were exempted from any environmental review by this federal government. And I have absolutely no doubt that if Bombardier was proposing to spend $20 billion to build a massive new airplane factory in the province of Quebec, not only would the federal government be exempting them from any regulation of the CO2 output from those airplanes, but they would be falling all over themselves to offer subsidies. And I have no doubt that if GM or Chrysler was proposing to spend $20 billion to create 8,500 good blue-collar jobs in Ontario to create new cars, that not only the federal government would they exempt them from any regulation or limitation on the emissions to be produced by those cars, but they would be offering subsidies to get it done. You know, I have said to the Prime Minister repeatedly, that we are prepared to talk about this 100 megaton cap on the oil sands. I said that to him on April 17th, 12 hours after we won the election. My environment minister has said it to his counterparts now for 9 months. We get zero response on this good faith effort to reach out and find common ground and find a way forward. We get zero response to that. Instead, all we get are these passive-aggressive messages constantly emanating from Ottawa, when all that we ask is that the rule of law be respected and that this country demonstrate that we're a safe place in which to invest, that we don't follow Banana Republic-style rules where political preferences are substituted for regulatory decisions. So when you say why, all I can say is if this government was really that obsessed about if their central issue was carbon emissions, they would have stepped in and stopped the McInnes cement factory in Gaspésie. They wouldn't be subsidizing Bombardier in Quebec and the auto companies in Ontario that are responsible ultimately for massive CO2 emissions. It's not about emissions. It's not about environment. It appears to be about the West.
And just a supplementary, you've made it clear in the letter what you think the reaction of Albertans will be if the Teck mine is not approved. And you made that clear in your letter. What will be the reaction of your government, different than the reaction of Albertans, if the Teck mine is not approved? You've already talked about the Western alienation, and people will be, extremely angry. People like Jack Mintz has said things will blow up here in Alberta. But what is going to be the reaction of your government, knowing that will be the reaction of Albertans? What will be your reaction if they decide to stiff Alberta on this particular project?
The reaction would be swift and serious. I hope it doesn't come to that. We have worked very hard in the past 3 months to hit the reset button on our relationship with the Government of Canada. We've demonstrated good faith. We put out the TIER program, worked hard to get an equivalency agreement on that. It's been commended by many people who are advocates for the environment. We've worked very hard to get an equivalency on methane regulations. We've been taking leadership on habitat protection on caribou and on bison. We have offered to talk to them about the 100 megaton cap. We have tried to find common ground wherever possible. And I hope that this government puts the politics aside. This, by the way, this is not, people across the country should be equally concerned about this. Because if this prospective $20 billion investment is killed because of politics in the Liberal caucus room, as opposed to the objective application of environmental rules through a transparent regulatory process, it will send a chilling effect to global investors about the security of investing in this country. So that is why this is not, this would be, I think, a huge, historic mistake, economic mistake for the government to make if they were to reject it.
How concerned are you about, we're seeing the blockades happening against Coastal GasLink all over the place. How concerned are you about similar actions of civil disobedience in regards to TMX and then eventually perhaps Teck?
Well, it's no secret that the same groups have been planning. I think this is a dress rehearsal for illegal protests on pretty much any major project. But let me just point out, again, the hypocrisy of all of this. The Coastal GasLink project is designed to take Canadian natural gas to our west coast, export it to developing countries like China, to help accelerate their conversion from high-emitting thermal coal to radically lower emissions from natural gas. We're always told we should have policy that's based on evidence. Well, the evidence is this. The single greatest thing that Canada could do to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions and to address the climate issues would be massively to increase our exports of LNG. Right now we have virtually none. If these folks were actually concerned about CO2 emissions, they would be calling for the acceleration of the Coastal GasLink project, not trying to shut down our economy, commuters, people trying to get to work because they're opposed to Canada playing a role in the essential conversion of thermal coal to natural gas as a major source of energy around the world. And it's certainly not about Indigenous rights, because every one of the 20 elected First Nations councils along the Coastal GasLink route, following extensive consultations with their grassroots members, including the elected council of the Wet'suwet'en people, support the project, including the majority of the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en people. There are Wet'suwet'en people who have been hired by Coastal GasLink, contractors who have been contracted, ready to get to work. As former Chief Councillor Ellis Ross of the Haisla First Nation, current MLA in British Columbia, said, this isn't about Indigenous rights, this is about eco-colonialism, coming from people in urban southern Canada who are projecting their own fringe political agenda on the Indigenous people of northwestern Canada, who want to give a lifeline of hope to their young people. As Chief Ellis Ross said in a video posted this week, you know, when you're a chief in one of those communities, when you're a leader, your main responsibility is to ensure that the teenagers in your constituent, in your band, have an alternative to dependency, despondency, and sometimes a life of addiction. And he said that alternative is employment. So this is not about Indigenous people. It's not about it's not about carbon emissions. It's about a hard left ideology that is frankly opposed to the entire modern industrial economy. And I think it's about time that our police services demonstrated that this is a country that respects the rule of law. allowing people to, completely destabilizing the lives of tens of thousands of people, costing all of us untold costs in our economy by shutting down ports and bridges, highways and railways, in opposition to the express democratic wishes of First Nations, is outrageous, and it has to end.
Meanwhile, back in Alberta's backyard, you have Athabasca Chipewyan expressing concerns about how the provincial government has dealt with its concerns related to the Teck Frontier pipeline. How reasonable is it for Ottawa to give some delay to its decision on Teck so that Alberta can get its house in order with Athabasca Chipewyan?
First, I invited Environment Minister Nixon, anticipating that question. Come on up, Jason, because he's been dealing very closely with that First Nation.
First of all, it's, from my understanding from Chief Adams' comments, are primarily concerns that he has raised around caribou and bison protection. The reality is that the Ronald Lake bison herd is well protected already by the province. We are working towards a partnership with the 14 Indigenous communities that are in the area, to a groundbreaking partnership to help manage that herd together. And the primary threat to that herd, the Ronald Lake bison herd, comes from Wood Buffalo National Park and from federal bison that the Alberta government has been calling on the federal government to deal with for a long time, long before the Premier and I were in these roles. And so if that's the primary concern, we agree with Chief Adam, and we will continue to call on Minister Wilkinson and his department to take the necessary steps to be able to protect that herd. In addition, caribou, which is a major issue in the north right now, the Alberta government created a large wildland provincial park in that area, creating the largest boreal forest protected area in the world to be able to protect caribou habitat. We've also indicated to Chief Adam and the Indigenous communities that are in the area that we're prepared to even extend that further in partnership with oil companies that are, energy companies that are in the area. So from our perspective, we've taken very significant action on species at risk issues up there. And the primary issue that needs to be addressed is actually on the federal government side to protect the Ronald Lake bison herd. We have met with Chief Adam and his nation close to a dozen times in the last few months, myself face-to-face twice. And we are going to continue to work with all 14 Indigenous communities in the area to mitigate issues that come up and be able to work together with them in partnership as our government has laid out. But Chief Adam primarily seems to want to discuss money. And while I understand that it is his responsibility to drive the best deal he can for his constituents and for his band, it is also our responsibility to make sure that we work on behalf of Alberta taxpayers and move forward in a productive way for that portion of the province.
They're looking for accommodations, and this is a word that's been very much part of the vocabulary federally, not so much in Alberta. Are you guys willing to give further concessions or give something more to the Athabasca Chipewyan so that you can justify what Mr. Kenney's been saying for so long, that all 14 First Nations communities are fully in support of the project? Right now, that's no longer the case.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with the statement that is no longer the case. Chief Adam actually went out of his way to make it clear that he still supports the Frontier project, and his nation has signed on to that, as have the other nations, the other 13 nations that we refer to when we use that 14 nation number. We are working closely with Chief Adam and his nation, as we are with all nations in the area. We'll continue to do that. I'm not going to go into great detail of all negotiations that are taking place at this moment, but we are working actively on that. And we'll continue to advance the interests of our province and of the nation, and we'll continue to do it with the lens that the Premier and our government has put on this issue, which is to continue to work towards options to be able to share in prosperity in this province.
My question though was, would a delay by Ottawa based on this overhanging concern from Athabasca Chipewyan be reasonable?
No, it would not be reasonable, primarily because the main reason that the chief has indicated he's concerned is primarily concerned about the bison herd, the Ronald Lake bison herd, which is under threat, not from the Frontier mine, it's under threat from the national government, who has not dealt with their bison herd inside Wood Buffalo National Park. As I said when I spoke to you last week, from our perspective, a delay on this project would be the same as rejecting it. We have overcome every environment issue that has been put in front of us, and we'll continue to work with all 14 First Nation communities to address their concerns in an ongoing way.
Premier, the NDP
I'll
wants...
just add a clarification, or just an additional comment there, which is what I've said is that all 14 proximate First Nations communities have signed conditional benefit agreements with Teck over the Frontier mine after years of discussions with them. And in terms of accommodation, one of the things I'm happy about, and it frankly is where we've exceeded expectations as a government in the last 9 months, is in our relationships with First Nations and Métis communities. And I invite you to speak to any number of chiefs about how hard we've been working on accommodation and inclusion. You can just look at the public comments from Fort McKay Chief Mel Granjam about the work of Minister Nixon on accommodation, or speak to Chief Roy Fox in the Kainai First Nation about that, or Chief Billy Morin at Enoch, for example. So we're working very hard on those issues. But listen, Athabasca, Fort Chippewa were included in the exhaustive first Indigenous consultations under the Joint Review Panel, which led to approval, and with the company. There are issues, as Jason says, a lot of them dealing with the federal government, and we're happy to do what we can to help there.
On the emissions cap,
Back there,
the NDP wants your government to call out City Councillor Calgary, Joe Magayoka's gross misuse of taxpayers' dollars when it came to
Who wants me to?
The NDP wants your government, along with Minister Casey Madu, to call out, I guess, a gross misuse of spending of taxpayers' dollars. Will your government do so? I think that's it's a matter for the Calgary City Council. I'm not actually aware of the issue. I would encourage all city councils to have proper rules for expensing, for expense management, and whoever might be putting in expenses, they should be properly receipted and filed according to certain rules. We certainly have that at the provincial level. Sorry.
There were figures that came out from Ottawa that show that they see a difference in the emissions cap than your government does. It's about 20 megatons. They say they're calculating it the same way you guys are. I know you've talked to them about it, but is the emissions cap, can it be credible if that gap exists?
Listen, all I can tell you is that our numbers are the same numbers as the NDP government. They were the numbers accepted by the federal Liberal government when they negotiated this notional oil sands emissions cap. So we haven't come up with novel numbers. This is the science, this is the data. My understanding is that the federal government had already accepted our numbers as the baseline for the proposed 100 megaton cap. If they're suddenly changing their criteria, well, they haven't informed us apart from one-off spontaneous remarks in the media in the last week. I think they're scrambling, frankly. I raised with Justin Trudeau, amongst other, I said, look, I'm committed to trying to find common ground with your government on issues related to energy and the environment. I said this to him on the morning of April 17th, the morning after we were elected. I said it to him again in person on May 2nd, 3 days after we were sworn in. I said it to him again on December the 10th when I was in Ottawa with Team Alberta. I've said it to him on the phone a number of times, and I know that Minister Nixon has with his two counterparts. We've said to them, let's talk about the 100 megaton cap. What exactly does it mean? If we in fact proclaim the legislation adopted by the NDP, are you going to assure that there is a future for the oil sands? You may recall, by the way, that after he tried to walk back his comments in Peterborough 3 years ago about phasing out the oil sands, the Prime Minister took several steps back. He said that comment was misconstrued. He said no country with 178 billion barrels of oil would leave that in the ground. We are committed to developing that. That's what he told Albertans in this last election. And the test on this Teck mine isn't improvising a new way of counting emissions. It's whether or not there's actually a future for our energy industry. That's the question. Do we develop our energy as part of the source in the transition period, or do we abandon it all to OPEC? Because if new projects don't go forward, old projects, Syncrude, and they're operating assets that are from the 1970s, declining assets. If we don't have some new projects underway, there will not be a future for the oil sands. So on this question, look, as far as I understand it, their numbers include conventional drilling in the Athabasca region, not just oil sands. Their numbers include bitumen production in Saskatchewan, not just in Alberta. Their numbers include the power production done by the companies, which increasingly is low-emitting natural gas cogen co-located at these sites that feeds into the grid. Professor Leach had a lengthy commentary about this the other day. So our numbers, the same as the NDP numbers, they're the numbers that apparently the federal Liberals accepted until it became inconvenient for them.
So Mr. Wilkinson, in those remarks, did say, though, that he expects this government to regulate and enforce the cap. Is that something you're looking at doing in the near future, to at least regulate it so that you're using the same language rather than the legislation from 2016?
If that is the position of the Government of Canada, then they've never told me that. I've been asking for a dialogue on this for 9 months. They never told our Environment Minister that. They haven't written us a letter about this. They haven't responded to us in meetings or in phone calls on this. So I'm not going to start getting into an improvised negotiation via media, with all due respect. One last question, because I'm late to chair a cabinet meeting.
Can we ask you about your spending? So in light of the City Council spending, there has been a thread on Reddit about your recent trips over to other places and how much you spent on those trips. Can you give us a response to that? Some people are saying it's overspending for a fiscally responsible government.
Well, my response is that I actually ran for 3 years on a commitment to take Alberta's story, to fight for this province across the country, and to tell our story in Quebec, to build coalitions with like-minded premiers and provinces, to do everything possible to get investment back in Alberta. And that's exactly what I've been doing, by going to Bay Street and Wall Street, by going to provincial capitals across the country, by meeting with some of the largest companies and financial institutions in the world in London, England, by meeting with the largest energy companies in the world in Houston. So I'm doing exactly what I said I would do, and we do it as efficiently as we can. I always fly economy. You know, I was flying over there to London, England, to meet with the CEOs of some of the world's largest banks and the chairman of the governor of the Bank of England in the back of the economy section of WestJet, and stay in government-selected mid-range hotels. I mean, I suppose, what does the NDP want me to do, stay in youth hostels or something? I mean, hitch a ride with Greta on her boat or something? I'm sorry, there is a cost to getting around. And Premier Notley, we never once raised an objection or a question about her travel expenses, I don't believe, not when I was opposition leader. I think she spent 70 grand to take the cast of Ben-Hur over to stay in Paris, be one of the, tens of thousands of delegates at that climate meeting and so on. So she spent, something like 25 grand to go to New York for Climate Week and give a speech. So, look, she had her responsibility as Premier to represent Alberta, and I do too. And you can't do it for free, but we do it as cheap as we can.
Monsieur Kenney, sur vos relations avec le gouvernement fédéral, vendredi, vous parliez de transition énergétique, vous parliez de relations plus constructives. Aujourd'hui, vous êtes beaucoup plus combatif. Alors, est-ce que vous avez un discours différent à l'international que vous l'avez en Alberta?
Par contre, j'ai dit justement qu'on a essayé de développer une nouvelle relation avec le gouvernement du Canada et on a négocié, par exemple, les ententes d'équivalence sur le tarif sur les grands émetteurs. Nous travaillons sur une entente sur les émissions de méthane et plusieurs autres enjeux. Et nous prenons au sérieux le défi du changement climatique et nous voulons travailler avec le fédéral. Mais ce que j'ai dit est que le même gouvernement fédéral a donné une exemption aux réglementations fédérales sur l'émission de gaz à effet de serre pour une usine de ciment en Gaspésie qui produit 2 millions tonnes de charbon par année. Et je crois que c'est impensable que le gouvernement fédéral aura menacé d'arrêter un investissement dans l'industrie aérienne au Québec où les manufacturiers des automobiles en Ontario. Mon responsabilité
et à défendre les intérêts économiques essentiels des Albertains. J'espère... quant à M. Legault, on a une bonne amitié, une bonne relation. Il nous appuie contre le projet de loi C-69 du fédéral, contre l'imposition de taxes sur le carbone du fédéral. Il s'est exprimé en faveur des corridors de l'énergie au Canada. Nous sommes vraiment en bonne relation. Il est en faveur des exportations de gaz liquéfié naturel du Québec. Alors, j'ai pas une chicane avec... J'étais à Québec, j'ai souligné dans quelle mesure nous nous entendons bien avec le gouvernement actuel du Québec. I'm 20 minutes late to chair a cabinet meeting. Thanks very much, everyone.